All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the 220th Governance and Risk Call here at MakerDAO. My name is Peyton. I go by Pros11 Online, and I am one of our governance facilitators. Really grateful to be here with all you today. This is our first Governance and Risk Call back in the new year, 2023. Today is January 5th for historian purposes. Yeah, joined by a bunch of people who either already contribute or are already familiar with the Maker protocol or would like to be more familiar. So we really do appreciate all of you that joined us live. As you might have noticed, this call is being recorded. So hello if you're watching from a later date. Should be a fairly simple call though, just a few rules we like to go by to help make it a better time for both us here live and watching the recording later. First off, let's avoid talking over one each other, just a good rule to have in general, but also it's pretty terrible for recording quality. If you can, turn those screens on. It's always nice to see some people talking back at us. Obviously, we respect pseudonymity and all that fun stuff, so we understand if you have a reason to keep your camera off, but if you don't, turn it on and join us. It's always nice to see who's joining us and what's going on in their life. We have reactions as well as the chat that are really useful for Zoom. In particular, I like the raised hand function. That helps me a lot out as a host. If you have a question, a comment you want to add, basically, if you want to join the speakers list, all you need to do is go over to reactions, click that raised hand button, and it lets me know you have something to say. Likewise, if you can't find that feature or otherwise aren't familiar with it, you can always drop your question or comment in the chat and we'll work it in at an appropriate time. Also seeing some cool virtual avatars, so always welcome as well. And final introduction, apologize for all the rules as we get started here, but that's to introduce yourself if you can while you speak. That'll help with the recording and everyone getting along in the call. All right, so as usual, we do have a bit of an agenda to get through today. We'll start with our typical governance roundup, going over what's happening on votes and in the land of MIPS. Today, we have a really cool initiative update. Got some folks from HATS protocol to talk about what they're building and why it might make sense for Maker. And then finally, we are going to be talking about our scope frameworks for in-game in our discussion segment today. So if you're unfamiliar with in-game, it'll be quite the dive in, a deep rabbit hole, if you will. But for those vaguely familiar, it hopefully will be a pretty cool way to engage and learn about some of the building blocks that make in-game a thing, and introduce kind of a three-part series we have on talking about what in-game is and how we're going to be contributing to it. All right, that's enough regular rambling for me. I'll get into the good old votes rambling. Luckily, there's not too much for me to talk about. Obviously, with the holidays, we took a bit of a break. We will have a ton of polls coming out on Monday, so do be mindful of those. You're going to hear from our MIP editors about all the polls going in for MIPS ratification. We also have a few one-offs to announce, so keep an eye out on the forum for those. Likewise, we do have a number of individual items in the executive we're expecting for next Wednesday. Those include delegate compensation, core unit die budgets, as well as some MKR vesting. So keep an eye out for those on the forum and in Discord. We'll be keeping you updated on their progress. Cool. With that, I will turn the mic over to our MIP editor. I believe Gala is with us to walk us through the slides today. Is that right?
Yes, hello, Peyton. This is Gala, MIP editor from GlobalFA. So today we are in January. The formal submission window for this governance cycle closed yesterday. We have 16 proposals that were formally submitted. So let's take a look at them. For our top level MIPS, there's MIP 92 that will onboard 100 million of PSM USDC into a bespoke non-custodial earn vault. Next, for the amendments and removals, we have proposals to remove the die transfer ceiling on MIP 14 protocol die transfer. Another one to remove MIP 14 altogether. One to amend the recognized delegate participation metrics. One to amend the Maker Keeper Network MIP. One to remove MIPs 23 and 28. And finally, one to remove the calendar exceptions on MIP 51. Next, for our core unit framework, we have the core unit offboarding proposals for GovComs. for our funding requests, we have two special purpose funds. One is to cover strategic finances, expanded mandate related to real world assets, and another one for developing a proof of performance for Viridian cluster. We have two protocol DAI transfer requests as well. So one is to fund the tech ops for the month of February 2023, and one to fund Immunify security from December of last year to March 2023. Finally, our three last proposals. It's one proposal to onboard Chainlink as a keeper network, a declaration of intent to develop an on-chain monitoring solution for real-world assets, and a proposal to use DSS Kiln to restart the burning of MKR. These proposals will go on-chain as certification polls next Monday. So next we have our proposals in RFC. There are a few of them. For our top level MIPS, there's MIP 90, onboarding a real world vault to acquire USDC and then purchase structured credit and money market funds. MIP 91, introducing the concept of a defender contract against governance attacks. And MIP 93, proposing and utilizing the HATS protocol. The HATS protocol allows for real-time on-chain verifiable roles to be maintained throughout the Maker protocol. As Peyton just mentioned, this is our initiative update today. So stay there if you're interested. And also we have a Know Your MIP call. This is next week. So please join if you're interested in diving deeper into this. I am putting the link in the chat for our call. Next, we have for the amendments and removals. There's an amendment proposal that modifies MIP 41 to expedite some of its processes and increase its flexibility. And finally, for the core unit framework proposals, we have core unit offboarding proposal for CES, a budget request by Tech Ops, and a facilitator onboarding proposal for Nick 0 to lead CES. Note that these are not all the core unit framework proposals that have been posted in the forum. However, those that are not in this list are for now are only placeholders. So finally, for our important dates, as I mentioned, and this Monday, all of the proposals in formal submission are going on chain as certification polls for 2 weeks. And also, if you're planning to submit a new proposal, you should do it by January the 11th. That's next Wednesday, if you wish for the proposal to be eligible for February's cycle. So that's it for MIPS. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Gala. Thank you, one of our MIP editors, for putting that together. Obviously, a lot coming down the pipeline, so do pay attention to the forums and on the voting portal starting Monday. All right, so we don't have a forum update this week. Obviously, things have been a little bit more sparse with the holiday break. There are still been a lot of good threads going on, so we do encourage you to check that out. And we'll try to have something prepared for you for next week, giving you a little more overview. Awesome. Looks like Gala's got the chat covered. Thank you. And with that, I think we will go into our initiative updates. So as we mentioned a couple of times already, we're going to be hearing from the fine folks over at HATS Protocol. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so I can assist in a demo. And it looks like I see Nick on the screen there. Hi, Nick. You should have screen sharing powers should you need to use them.
Perfect.
Awesome.
How does that work?
Love it when
Does that
technology
look okay?
works.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, if you just want to take it away, Nick, looks like we can see the screen perfectly clear.
Perfect. And it should take less than 5 minutes, right?
I'm not having your audio, though.
Test. Test 1, 2.
No.
I can hear Nick fine.
Okay, you can.
Yeah, I think it might.
One more time.
Test 1, 2. Testing.
So it might be me. I'll shut up and let you talk and try to figure out my issues.
Okay, perfect. I was asked to take less than 5 minutes, so I'll go with that guideline unless I get another advice here. So I'll just share a couple slides and then I'll show you the contract. So my name's Nick. You can call me Nick. One of the people who started this project in the middle of last year, along with David Ehrlichman and Spencer Graham. And HATS protocol is really focused on how DAOs actually get things done and assign authorities, responsibilities, and accountabilities to people with specific roles. So the biggest challenge we've been working in DAOs for the last 2 years, and we've lived this pain of kind of disorganization, chaos, people running around in Discords, making social agreements, trying to get work done. It's really messy. And we think that the key things we're trying to solve are the lack of clear roles and responsibilities, the fact that those roles are not legible on chain for distribution of power and access, and that DAO votes are not always the most effective decision-making structure. Sometimes you want to delegate decision-making to a small group or to an individual, and HATS helps you do all this on chain. We think about HATS as role-bound tokens that represent specific sets of responsibilities and authority for individual contributors. There are tokens that are governed by the DAO. So they're ERC 1155s that have been modified to not be transferable by the people who have them in their wallet, but they are transferable by the DAO or a delegate of the DAO. They have a specific scope of authority. So you get a token ID that you can connect to various token gates like Guild XYZ or Collabland, and use that to plug into your various platforms. And then lastly, they're built for automation. So at first, you'll have the DAO voting to grant or revoke or transfer HATS, but eventually you can bring your own smart contract logic to grant and remove HATS under certain conditions. And some of the examples and benefits you get here, and this will be my last slide before we go to the contract, is you can kind of think about a hat as like a job in a box. So once you go through the DAO proposal for getting a hat to an individual contributor or creating an entire hat tree of all of the existing structure that you guys have at MakerDAO, for example, every person will have everything that they need in order to get their work done in a way that has the single source of truth on chain. And this might include things like Discord roles, multi-sig signing authority, voting weight in off-chain votes, access to post to a shared Twitter account for a core unit or for the whole DAO, as well as things like compensation in on-chain formats that could be gated via the fact that you have this hat in your wallet, as well as accountability, including the removal of the hat, or in other cases, we've seen people doing things like staking ETH on responsibilities that they've taken. So I'll pause there for now and move over to the contract quickly. Basically, and I'll send links to this in the chat as soon as I finish talking through this, but here's the early deployment of HATS protocol beta v0.6, which is the current deployment. Some of the key functions that are going to be needed for the multi-sig transaction we're going to do with MakerDAO will be creating HATs. So when you think about creating an actual HAT token, you plug in the admin, who in this case will be the DAO by default, but is the person who can grant the HATs. Details, which can be anything that you want, a HAT name or IPFS link, a max supply of the number of that particular HAT token. And then the eligibility, which is that area where you have you can bring your own smart contract logic or point to the DAO to say this is the person or the logic that will revoke the HAT. A toggle, which actually turns the entire HAT token on or off across all of the HATs that are outstanding. We have a Boolean for mutability, so you can change HATs from mutable to immutable once you feel like they are kind of solidly what you need. And of course, they're kind of like NFTs, so we have an image URI to include. And then minting HAT happens separately from creating a HAT. We'll go too much more into detail there. You can view all the docs in our GitHub repo. Like I said, I'll send the link, but the docs are located here. And then we are under MIP 93. So I'll send all these links. Any questions, please let me know.
Right on, and appreciate you coming out here to talk to us, Nick. And looks like I got David from and Spencer, I think, from HATS as well. I know we're going to get more into like the nitty-gritty of like how this can be used for Maker next week. But I'm curious if maybe you could spend a minute or two just talking about kind of Hat's origin story and why exactly you decided to start jumping on these governance problems?
Absolutely. Spencer and I were collaborating in the context of Raid Guild, which is, for those who don't know, a DAO that's sort of a freelance a group of freelance designers, developers, account managers, product managers who came together, I think in 2019 or early 2020, to basically serve become a development agency for other Web3 projects, even before it was called Web3. Building dApps in a decentralized way and really testing out this ethos of how do we operate without managers. And I think that as Raid Guild evolved, we started to look at interesting mechanisms that could support accountability around specific roles and responsibilities. So in Raid Guild, you get put on a project, which is called a raid. You might be pseudonymous or anonymous, and how do you actually hold that person accountable to their work, and how do you give them all access to all the platforms that they need, like the channels that they're going to talk in on Discord, or access to client specific documents, and ultimately, like, how do you start to hold people accountable to and build reputation for the work that they did, especially if they came in pseudonymously. So we started building an early mechanism there. We saw that this was a very common need, and Spencer sent over the kind of more formal architecture in April and said, hey, I think we should work on this. What do you think? And I was super excited about it. We didn't even call it Hats then. And David had been organizing a network called Groundwork, which had pulled together over 60 DAO leaders, DAO stewards, including Lenkla from Maker, who I'm sure some of you know. And we kind of could verify across this entire network that this is such a deep pain point, and an opportunity to make DAOs much more effective. DAOs are really awesome at being decentralized, but Maker is one of the few DAOs that consistently gets stuff done. And I think in order to evolve this whole space, we really need to get to the point of efficiency of getting things done collaboratively, collectively, without giving up the benefits of decentralization that DAOs really get us, and the ability to share resources and govern public goods as sovereign individuals coming together into collectives.
It's really awesome. And I think a lot of us can really, a lot of people on this call have seen Maker through from foundation to DAO to this next chapter of in-game. And kind of the, I don't know, uniting factor seems to be that like it all comes down to coordination, all comes down to organization. And I think just by default, we tend to use a lot of like Web2 tooling because it's, what we're used to. And it doesn't always work so well with pseudonymous identities. It doesn't always work so well with the decentralized like workforce. So yeah, I don't know. I was very excited to hear some of the native Web3 solutions that we're talking about here. And just to highlight again, like let's see, you talked about potentially being used in multi-sigs, like Discord gated chats, like organizational structures. Like it seems like it really provides a lot of sandboxes to play on. Is there a direction or any area in particular that you're most excited about? That I guess like if you looked into the crystal ball, where do you see Hats having the most impact in the next 5 years?
This is a great question. I think that what we're kind of doing is creating, Hats tried to be the most unopinionated primitive that we could create that would enable people to use it as a sort of structural Lego for organizational design. And that means that we didn't take a particular angle on how to organize the roles. So you want to have a DAO that has a traditional hierarchical structure, or you want to introduce holacracy, or you want to try futurarchy, or any kind of model of authority delegations between individuals, you're free to do that with Hats protocol. I think where it becomes really amazing, and kind of where David is a secret weapon for this project, is when we can create an entire ecosystem of people who are building organizational structures and kind of like small compositions of Legos that are easily forkable and replicatable, eligibility contracts that you can kind of pick up off the shelf and use, that brings the logic for when someone should have their hat revoked. and that all of those people are coming together and kind of advancing the state of the art of human coordination through organizational forms. I think together we can push forward the cutting edge of what an organization of human beings actually is. So we're creating the HATS DAO to support the evolution of the space using the HATS protocol as a primitive, and we can even imagine the amazing stuff that's going to come out of that.
Right on. Well, I feel like I've been monopolizing some of the question space, so definitely want to encourage others to ask. I saw Francis in our chat, one of our recognized delegates, was asking if this was a result of an inbound or an outbound lead. Kind of our collaboration with HATS, wasn't really sure how to answer that other than say, like, I got connected with Nick in Bogota, and we really hit it off after chatting about what HATS was trying to do. And I definitely noticed a lot of governance challenges that have been plaguing me kind of present on Nick's tinkering. So that was kind of how this came to be, and we're still figuring out the best way to work together and place it within the ecosystem. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that there will be a lot of opportunities within the in-game framework to work with HATS. So if there's a way that works organization wide, great. If it's more of an individual, like kind of Lego, great. Mostly my kind of aim is just to make people more familiar with it and all the cool things that we're trying to do. Particularly because a lot of things delegates have asked about, like token gated chat and vault owners chat and more multi-sig security, like our direct applications for HATS. So it's clear there's a lot of similar surfaces we're working on there. Cool. I do see a hand from Raphael, another one of our recognized delegates. If you want to take it away.
Thanks, Peyton. Yeah, Nick, thanks for the demo, for the short demo or the deck. And what I'm wondering about is, like, how does the role management work? And, like, especially with decentralization in mind, like it seems that, like, worst case that I can imagine is that it's kind of like a Microsoft Active Directory for DAOs, and then there's some poor person who has to sit somewhere and manage all of that. And maybe I'm sure you came up with something that's much more DAO native, but maybe you can give us or me a short explainer, like how roles get managed, how that can propagate through the DAO, so that this really stays centralized and doesn't become like a centralized bottleneck for the organization.
100%. It's funny that you bring up Active Directory, because someone else made that analogy, and it really helped me understand kind of the progression of what has existed in the past and what we're doing now and how it's related. It is kind of like that. The one difference I would highlight to answer your question is really around the ability for any hat to create child hats underneath it. So and then manage those using the eligibility contracts. So we separated granting and revoking intentionally. Granting is done by if you hold a hat, you can create a child hat that you would be the admin of, and then once you have created that hat, you can also mint that hat to whichever addresses you find that you should do that to. The eligibility contract or the address that goes into the eligibility field is really the revocation logic. So you might want to create and mint the hat, but make it so that some other council of evaluators, someone else in the core unit, is responsible for revoking the hat. Or more likely, what we keep seeing as an interesting use case is adding some specific smart contract logic that says, okay, if this person hasn't signed the multi-sig in the last 60 days, if this person hasn't been compensated by this address within the last 2 epochs, then automatically remove their hat. Or if they drop below, say, a certain amount of delegated MKR, would be another type of logic that we could bring. And that's really how HATS maintains the decentralization of kind of the responsibility of holding people accountable to their individual roles. And obviously, the other thing I'll mention is that hats can be worn by individuals, EOAs, but they can also be worn by multi-sigs. DAO, we can we'll send the top hat to the pause proxy or a contract that is managed by the pause proxy. So they can obviously be sent to contracts as well. So we benefit from utilizing all of the existing decentralization of the core DAO contracts and empower the core DAO contracts to use HATS protocol in this kind of tree-like way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think in theory, like I want to maybe have a practical example so I can understand it better. Like for instance, I think a couple of months ago, 4 of us became multi-sig signers to manage the Velodrome airdrop to MakerDAO, and I really enjoyed the process because it was so permissionless. And I think this is exactly what attracts me to crypto. And it was basically, there was a thread on the forum and there was agreed that this should happen. And then Shupi just spun up the multisig and we got going, right? Like there was no permission necessary. So I think, how can that happen on HATS, right? Like how can we keep that permissionlessness? Because I think this is really one of the tenets that enable DAOs and will unlock DAO productivity in the future, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working right now on ways of people being able to create, just like you could just create a multisig and get started permissionlessly, you should be able to create a branch of HATS and then later graft it onto a tree. So that's definitely functionality that we see as important. In the meantime, right now, one of the core things we solve for is the connection between the multisig and the DAO. So when you actually create the multisig, you can add signers permissionlessly, or you could create a hat that gives someone signing authority, and then make sure that the DAO is giving the individuals who are supposed to be signers that hat. And now the DAO has that kind of ability to revoke to make sure that the signers are the right people and make sure that there's no bad actors acting on that multisig, because the DAO is really delegating that authority to the 4 of you, say, as an example, as multi-sig signers. So it creates a slight amount more overhead and a lot more security for the DAO itself.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. We did have one more question in chat, and I think I'll toss that to you guys and then probably call it there. As a reminder, we do have a dedicated session next week, so I'll get a hand from Patrick if you want to say something first. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was happy to wait to have the question, but I'll go now. I was just wanting to flag a use case that kind of convinced me that this could be helpful for Maker. I'm sure Peyton won't necessarily mind me saying when he first pitched this to me, I was quite confused about why we would bother and how is this that useful. But a recent example of where we really could have used something like this would have been the recent interim facilitator appointment process that we went through on the forum. So we had to get votes from all of the current active facilitators on candidates for whether they accepted them to become the interim facilitator for CES. And the first round was just a straight yes/no vote, so we could use the forum architecture for that. That worked fine. But then when we needed to proceed to the fallback process, which used IRV, so runoff voting, we actually couldn't do that using the forum architecture. So if we had a hat set up where each facilitator had a hat that they'd been granted by the DAO effectively, you could have set up a snapshot instance and used them for voting, and that would have actually solved the entire problem. The end result of how we had to do it was to basically send everyone a Discord DM saying, please rank your candidates, and then put it into a spreadsheet and make that generate a winner. So that was a really good example to me of how we could use this for something that would have saved us a hell of a lot of time and a lot of effort. Would have taken 5 minutes instead of a couple of hours. And so just wanted to provide some color there for other potential use cases and things that we've come across since looking at this protocol and saying, oh, actually hats would be really good for this. So just wanted to provide that insight there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. So I do like that kind of client services question, but maybe we'll table that to the call next week and give people a little lead in or reason to attend. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come here, and seems like we've got plenty to discuss. So look forward to the follow up next week.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. Feel free to reach out on Twitter or Telegram, and yeah, we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll get back into screen sharing mode here. Okay. Should be back up and running there. All right. Huge thanks again to the guys at Hats. That call, again, is next week on Wednesday. So take a look at our public calendar and make sure you don't miss it. That'll take us into our discussion segment of this call. We got a little less than an hour of our typically scheduled time. And we wanted to kind of kick off the year talking about in-game scopes. So this is like, if you've been around, you've obviously heard about in-game and some talks about scope framework and a whole bunch of other buzzwords about the in-game structure. But we figured it's probably past time to start highlighting exactly what is written and what's been discussed about some of these structural items for in-game. So yeah, kind of going to be having Retro from now the interim CS facilitator help walk us through this stuff. But our plan is kind of use this breakdown of scopes and frameworks, sub-DAOs and ecosystem actors, and then just the game theory of in-game to kind of give three little presentations during these GNRs, open up some discussions and help people kind of see where they can contribute and get a better understanding of in-game. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too much, Retro. Is there anything you'd like to kick off with introduction wise?
No, appreciate the introduction. You're a natural already at this, but yeah, like Peyton highlighted, today's presentation is primarily going to focus on scopes and frameworks. We'll be diving into the terminology a little bit, end with a call to action, and then happy to answer any questions there. If you could hop to the next slide, back one, there we go. What we're looking at here are the 12 defined scopes, and each scope has an accompanying framework that defines basically the entire ecosystem and operations of MakerDAO. On the top level, we see the 4 primary scopes, which relates to the products of MakerDAO. And beneath that, we have secondary and tertiary. The best way to think about this is that the top level, the primary product scopes are intended to receive the most attention, the most funding, the most expert input into guide the protocol towards the future path of resiliency. And then beneath it is more of like the operational support scopes that are required to enable the primary scopes. And we'll show an example in a couple slides. But taking a deeper dive into what a scope is on the next slide. The best way to think about a scope is that it's a meeting point for governor DAOs or now renamed facilitator DAOs and operations to improve. This is the meeting point between DVCs, delegates, and then the facilitator councils and tribunals to take the strategy that MakerDAO wants to implement for the products, as well as the learnings from the operations of the decentralized workforce, and create this, again, meeting point or discussion to continuously improve our operations by using what we learn, documenting it, and making sure that in a decentralized environment where you have a lot of diverse teams working separately, that they're able to have shared learnings. If you could hop back one real quick. Oh, there we go. So again, this is focus areas. So all the scopes have the DVCs and the councils and tribunals as the working group, if you will. So the graphic demonstrates there that the dotted line separates the workforce in some of the day-to-day discussions about operations, maybe some conflicts, and suppresses that so that the strategy can be the primary focal point. From there as well, it really is the central reference point for all the organizational actions, because this primary document, again, is going to be used by several different players to assess if operations are running smoothly, if there needs to be certain structural improvements or operational improvements, defining a sub-DAO or a ecosystem actor's quality of work, and really just become a rubric. So if we advance ahead, the scopes, again, is the team that works on defining the framework. So the framework then is the primary output for guiding the workforce. Everything that needs to be done should be documented and detailed within this framework, because it enables the meritocracy and equality of the workforce then, where the best experts to contribute knowledge and expertise to how the DAO is working is in the position to do so. This also provides clarity and removes ambiguity from work through regulating certain actions, defining where reports should go, defining when reports should come out in certain cycles, as well as creating this platform for, again, enacting improvements. A lot of discussion and research has gone into this, especially through the sustainable ecosystem scaling projects of conducting the forum audit and trying to really extract as much knowledge as possible through that exercise. But I think everybody's very familiar with the forum. It really is this expansive environment where just about anything can be posted. But by refining this and forming the different segments, what we're expecting to see is that as business operates as usual, we'll be able to assess the quality of that. And then if there are these points of confrontation, we can make it productive. So instead of just resulting in a lot of noise on the forum, which historically we've potentially seen in the past, what this creates then is a specific process or exercise then to enact those improvements for sustainable change. And then finally as well, something that is formally being introduced through the end game plan is this concept of penalties. So it gives governance fangs where GovAlpha facilitators, for an example, have to try to assess, well, what is the best course of action if a rule is broken? About the only tool that they have right now is to bring a vote to governance to assess, what options should follow to correct that. This is going to clearly define then monetary penalties or potentially other restrictions for sub-DAOs and ecosystem actors that not only encourages the frameworks to be followed, but protects the DAO's best interest from an economic standpoint as well. So if we move to the next slide, what at a high level.
Sorry, before we move in there, I think Raphael had a relevant question on exactly what the frameworks are. If you don't mind hitting that before we go on to the next
slide.
Sure.
Let me know if this is the best time or we can go to discussion later.
No, definitely.
I'm a little unclear, like what frameworks exactly are, in a like a physical sense, or let's say structural sense. That is that like a bunch of documents that gets iterated on and that kind of govern these things, or is it the whole process as well, like the meetings, the work sessions that then kind of iterate on these outputs that you outline?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. At the top level, the scope is where the process, the engagement, the discussions, the quarterly meetings are defined. And then the framework itself is a document similar to a MIP. If somebody could grab the link from the forum, I'd appreciate the help. But Rune has posted an example or a preliminary draft for the third scope, being the real world asset collateral framework. And what that shows is that there's certain rules that define ideal collaterals. There's engagement processes for the workforce to follow. But then at the top level, where the framework is then worked on within the scope, the processes, the quarterly meetings, and things like that are then defined in the Constitution. And the Constitution itself will be a MIP in its own right that defines how the DAO and these different actors need to engage around improving the framework. That again is just something similar to a MIP that defines how the work should be done for the workforce then, and the penalties associated to breaking that.
So thanks, Richard. And I posted that link to the real world asset collateral framework draft if people want to take a look and see what he's talking about there. But I think that should be good to move on for now. And yeah, please do drop questions, especially if they're relevant for the slide. We can address them before we go on.
So something important to here to highlight, going back to that first slide showing all 12 and how there's the different layers. At the top, we do have the primary scope, but they are influenced by the second and third tier frameworks. So using decentralized collateral as an example, the primary scope would, again, define the certain ideal collateral types or targets or goals and how assessments need to be done and shared within the community. But then beneath that, operating the decentralized collateral, say once it's been onboarded, the stability and liquidity secondary scope would then influence how the decentralized scope is managed. Another example on the right would then be the interface. So how is the front end presenting the decentralized collateral across the various sub-DAOs that would also influence that particular scope or framework. And finance, again, which is primarily being defined as what sort of metrics and reporting is required, would influence the scope level above it, which would then influence the primary scope. So it is this sort of waterfall where at the top, the primary scopes would receive the most funding to enact and deliver through operations the strategy that's defined. But beneath it is really, I think, where a lot of the value is created, because it takes the concept of saying, this is a product, but then how do you support a product and its entire life cycle? And the entire structure of scopes and frameworks is then built to define the human processes and the discussion and collaboration about making them better, but then also the operations for, again, the complete life cycle. So it isn't like we're onboarding an asset and not able to support it. The entirety of the life cycle for a feature product or even a growth campaign is defined thoroughly and should be taken into consideration by the workforce as they're working to enact the various projects. So before moving on to the next slide, happy to pause here if there's any questions as well.
I got one I could maybe fire retro. So I know like a common shortcut I use is, right, I think of frameworks as kind of like the new MIPS, right? Like they're kind of like the new bylaws, the new ways which we define work. But that analogy definitely falls a little bit short. I think it's helpful for just kind of getting your mind around like, okay, how does this puzzle piece plug in? But maybe if we could hear a reflection or two on some of the ways that the frameworks are supposed to be different from our MIPS, that might be helpful before moving on.
Yeah, another great point. And I think that's going to be highlighted as we move deeper into the year, where the other supporting structures of Endgame really come into fruition. A primary example would be the Unified Coordination Toolkit, where the logic of these frameworks are built in to the actual user interface of how these DAOs are going to be communicating to the core. So one example could be the decentralized collateral has a defined onboarding process that requires an assessment, both for legal and technical. And within the unified toolkit, potentially it could be a very simple, drop the link for the report here, drop the link for the report here, and then that will start and feed into the scopes, the DVCs, the actual meetings, to make that information very organized, very accessible, and I think very comparable, where we see consistent formatting of reports across different posts, but to have that in a more structured environment where it's easier to navigate, it just reduces the cost of information and makes the logic that we're applying to operations a lot more accessible and applicable. So instead of going through the MIPS portal and having to read the text and come up with an interpretation, we'll be able to have the reports, the examples, different comparisons all organized, and potentially even feed that through live data based on performance and other applicable things that the DVCs need to guide maturing the frameworks.
Right on. That was great. Yeah, smart MIPS. I like that. That's a if we need some more fun names, we'll have them on the sideline for them. But yeah, I think you can carry on as a reminder. Just raise your hand, drop questions in the chat. Obviously, make some more engaging presentation if we can kind of meet you on your curiosities. So thanks for engaging folks, and yeah, continue on, Retro.
Yeah, so kind of expected in a ton of questions. This isn't too earth-shattering of information if you've been following the DAO. But on the next slide, we're prepared to make a call to action to everybody on this call and watching the recordings. We need help. We need you to contribute to writing scopes. There's a number of core units, very diversified in their backgrounds, as well as contributors and interested community members that bring rich experience to our community here. And it's time to share and use that. So what we're asking everybody here today is to contact one of the 4 ecosystem contributors via Discord. Our handles are listed below. And what we'll start to do is to form the working groups that will eventually lead into the DVCs that will start drafting these. One of the first scopes that have seen support has been the governance security scope. We had a meeting, I think one of the first times with every smart contract developer within the DAO in Rune a couple of weeks back, and started to build out the end game Discord to have different permission channels, so we can control the conversations. We can make sure that the experts are focused on exactly what they need to be, and then eventually we'll look to open that up to make it more transparent. But for right now, this is a slow iterative process where we want to make sure that the strongest input is able to be made and really lay down the foundation. I know there's been some concepts about or questions about the formatting and maybe where is this information going to live, and right now as this first step, we're really just trying to form the groups in order to start progressing that forward. As we mature this process, this will lead into, again, those DVC calls and creating shared documents, and then eventually getting it onto the forum like Rune demonstrated with the real world asset collateral scope, and sharing that for further community feedback. So yeah, please drop us a message, reach out to any of the 4 of us here. We'd be happy to hear what scopes you have interested in. If you're not sure which one you would like to contribute, definitely again, just ping us knowing that you have some interest, and we'll help sync you up with the working group where you can make the biggest impact.
Yeah, awesome. Because there's been a lot of talk. Some of us were at the delegate office hours a little bit before this, right? Just about like the transition phase and, exactly what work's going to look like between now and the launch of the sub-DAOs. And it's like, well, right now, the biggest thing is the scopes in the Constitution, right? We have to write the rules that are going to define the framework. So obviously, if you're here in this call, you've got some experience with decentralized governance, you got some knowledgeability about Maker, and can probably contribute in more ways than you realize. So a big part of this conversation is just kind of getting this out there, making sure we're on the same page for scopes and people feel like they can find a place to contribute and make the DAO better. So happy to open up conversation here. I know we had some potential discussion questions if we wanted it, but also happy to just see where people are at with scopes, and if there's parts they feel like they still don't understand or they'd like us to go into deeper.
Yeah, you reminded me of one point that I wanted to highlight as well, which is it may seem like the work we're doing today may not enact change for 6 months or whenever the Constitution gets ratified. But following up Rune's DVC call yesterday, there's going to be an increased focus on making sure that we can implement incremental changes that drive impact to the current structure of the DAO today. So I would not be surprised if we see work from a scope immediately start moving into MIPS in an incremental pace to start introducing these changes, playing with some of the new concepts. And the more that we could attack this earlier, I think the better off we'll be as a community, and ultimately the more insights that we can unlock too, it'll just help again build this recursive feedback loop of continuous improvement, which I think if we borrow that a little bit from the traditional industries that do it well, we'll be pleasantly surprised at the outcomes that they can drive. And I do want to highlight too a comment that Juan dropped in the chat, which is if anybody here knows of people outside of Maker that want to contribute, we are looking for experts to join as well. There's plenty of different roles within Endgame that they can eventually grow into, but someone interested that has strong expertise in one of these scope areas would be a great addition to the working group in the short term.
Yeah, I know one analogy I like to use when talking about governance is this like idea of running into brick walls. And I feel like by nature of being larger and bigger and earlier at Maker, we've run into a lot of walls, and that's good if you can learn from it, right? But I think that's kind of the real challenge of the scopes is like, okay, how do we take our lessons, both that we've experienced personally and that, you know, we can look back through history or through other protocols and see other mistakes, and how can we make them a more resilient structure, right? Like that's kind of the tagline for Endgame is resilience. Yeah, I don't know. I'm hoping to get discussion going a little bit here. One thing I've been reflecting a lot on was hearing Juan talk at, and I'm going to forget what conference even, but he referenced a lot about this idea that when we started with the DAO, we kind of took a very like optimistic view, right? We had very little rules. We said, all right, you do what you want, you come in here, you follow these, and we'll build a DAO. And in some ways it works, in some ways it didn't. So now as we're trying to reorg, it's kind of like, okay, well, how do we build this smartly? You know, how do we kind of take our lessons from the past and actually apply them in a way that's less optimistic, that says, okay, well, the fact is that people are going to make mistakes, that things aren't going to run as smoothly as we might have expected. So how do we design a system that can anticipate those shortfalls rather than scrambling to react every time they happen? So I don't know. One thing I'm excited about, at least scope wise, is looking back through some of our postmortems, looking back at some of the really informative risk posts on the forum, and kind of like noting what those things have highlighted. Because I think, in some regards, a lot of the scope work has already been done just by the culture of Maker, which is the very conservative, kind of backward looking and reflective community. So we have a lot of work. A lot of the stuff's out there. We just need to start coming together and collaborating. And I hope this is kind of a launching point for that. Yeah, I see 3F Good Meta, Frank, for one of our recognized delegates. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Retro, for putting this together. Two-part question here, circling back to the frameworks. How often can they be updated? Thinking as we move forward and Web3 gets more and more developed, there'll be definitely new, hopefully product market fit, things that will bring the retail clients back. And also, I like to think that the innovation is just going to continue to grow, right? So I guess my first part is, how often can you change the frameworks of each scope? And then the second part is, when creating these scopes, do you also need to include, I guess, incremental goals of each scope, or like leading targets, or does it boil down to the sub DAO level when it comes to goals and targets?
Yeah, again, a couple great questions. The frameworks within a scope are intended to be fairly fluid. The early days of drafting these is that iterations would be very quickly, but using the governance security scope as an example for how a framework will mature once endgame plan is up and running is the omnibus spell. So as intended, the omnibus concept is allowing sub-DAOs to submit their own spells that are intended to be perfect without errors to be enacted within an executive. If there is a framework breach or penalty that needs to be assessed because the spell isn't secure, then there's kind of a checkpoint that needs to occur. So first, if there's an opportunity to improve the framework by learning through that example and it hasn't been previously encountered and it hasn't been previously defined, that's almost a good thing. The way that the process will need to be set up is that as people are operating within the framework, if there is something new that needs to be documented and brought to the scope meeting, which is required to occur quarterly to enact those changes through a governance cycle. If, however, it is a well-defined thing within the framework that is breached and it should have been obvious that error shouldn't have occurred or they constructed the spell incorrectly, then that's a simple case to assess a penalty. So as time moves on, we expect that some aspects of the frameworks will see less and less iterations or at least a slower pace as they become more thorough and mature. But definitely early on that cadence will be a little bit quicker. And as the end game plan is discussed, it's defined basically a mandatory quarterly check on each of them. That may be quicker in the beginning, but then slows as time moves on. The second question, could you rephrase that again?
Yeah,
I was just
go for it, Frank.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just with regards to like leading targets, right? And kind of getting incremental goals. So as an example, right, that you have that growth scope there on the right-hand side of my screen. And I would imagine like a market-facing sub-DAO, they might be expected to grow revenues by whatever, 10x in the next 24 months. So, incremental goals like that, is that included initially in the framework, or is that boils down to the sub-DAO level, so to speak? So in other words, maybe I'm too early to be talking about these things.
No, I think it's a good point to bring up, and if you allow me, I'll use the real world asset collateral framework as the example that was posted in the forum. I believe it was like Article 2 mentioned some very specific parameters or limits for, say, like the PSM and different collateral types. I would expect to see that more so than like go out and accomplish X. It's more of like a target that's set that forms an upper limit, and potentially based on how the budgeting of operational funds evolves over time, we could see different incentives handed down to the sub-DAOs for performing and delivering against those targets. But the framework itself then would be more of like the restrictions that are associated with it. And then the DVCs can work with facilitators to form different, say, incentives to promote different actions to achieve those targets or to get closer or whatnot.
And to kind of build on that, right, the idea is that these are the rules, these are the barriers, and the sub-DAOs are supposed to be incentivized to, do as much as they can within those parameters and capture as much of their upside as possible. So, in a well-designed system, Frank, like the idea is that you'd make more money for making more deals, right? So as long as we define what you can't do and define like, basically some protections in place, the idea is that you would then be incentivized to run with those as much as you can. And I think that's what's pretty exciting as like a core unit contributor, right? Like one thing that was definitely missing from our model was this idea of like incentivizing going the extra mile, right? We just kind of assumed like, okay, well, CUs will have salary, they'll do their work and it'll be great. And, it didn't take too long to realize it's like, well, I could work 10 hours a day. It's like, or I could work 6. And it's like, if no one's really checking in on me, if there's no clear upside for putting in long hours, like, human nature, what do we expect is going to happen? And I think over the past 2 years or whatever it's been, our experimentation has been quite clear that, like, if you don't plan for things, like, it's not going to go optimally. So a lot of in-game was just defining these scopes and saying, okay, well, these are the 12 areas we need to care about, and these are kind of their order of importance in terms of resources. With that in mind, like, go. And yeah, I don't know, it's definitely an exciting environment for builders. So pretty curious to see what all will end up attracting.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess attracting outside contributors, you probably would want someone who understands the concept of Web3, correct? Or do you think that's not necessary? I mean, I guess for RWA, for that scope there, there's a plethora of people all around the United States, the country I'm in, that could probably have an input on that. But understanding the concept of Web3 and also DAOs is kind of difficult, right? So I guess what I'm asking is, are you looking for anyone or anything that is an expert in such a scope?
Looks like one.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say, Frank, the calls will be open. So we'll try to make it as open as possible. And ideally, we get a lot of people. I've been speaking with some people already that are like, oh, that's great, I'm going to start joining the calls. And then we'll kind of like get a bit like homework kind of for the next session. Okay, who'll do what to make sure that the framework actually progress. So I think that this might be a great kind of like introduction or a great starting point for someone that wants to get into Web3. And I don't know, as an example, it's like, okay, we need to, and I'm bringing this up because I heard it in the delegates call earlier today, but if someone wants to say, okay, I want to, we need to create like an offboarding program for potential people that start working with that. What does it look like? So maybe someone that's there in the call is like, oh, I have experience in this from Web2. So even if there's no experience in Web3 whatsoever, they might be to contribute a lot. So yeah, the calls will be open. Anyone will be able to assist whichever scope we want. We'll act a bit as facilitators to make sure that we stay on track and the good ideas are kept. And we can actually develop these things, and then we'll try to make everything as public as possible without any restrictions. That's the plan.
And I think in there's kind of this like return to value, right? One where it's like the idea that, okay, well, if you're an expert in your area and that applies to what you're doing, like, great, we want you aboard if you can provide that value. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for people who aren't necessarily Web3 familiar. It's probably going to be harder at the start, but especially once things are more established, like, we need a lot of experts on a lot of different areas. So if you have someone who's interested in mind, Frank, please do reach out.
I think it will make it a lot easier if we have a clear path to contribution and make it very visible where we want input and not. I think this is probably at the moment still a little bit opaque, but I expect that to just get a lot clearer once we start working on that. But I think this will probably just attract a lot of people if it's clear like what's needed and how they can contribute. And I think people will just show up because Maker is super visible and super interesting to a lot of folks out there, I think.
Definitely. And that is one question I have too, is just like, how can we effectively organize contributions, right? Because I think like there's a lot of people that are interested, like the meta, the shifting, the maker of it all is all quite exciting. And I think we'll have a lot of people who want to jump in, but making it like easy for that information to be accessible, for there to be a path to contribute without making too much noise is definitely going to be tough. But we'll see. Like I said, we're going to be utilizing this call more for in-game contributions. We'll be playing around with the DVCs. Yeah, basically the idea is just to try to get more work going in the in-game direction, because I don't know. Personally, I kind of feel like there's this perception that like, okay, well, game's going to happen in a certain amount of time, and then once it happens, then we'll start figuring it out, which might be like a sensible position to take as an individual, right? Certainly a lot of balls in the air at the moment, but as an organization, right, like there's a ton of work that needs to be done in order for us to launch, and we don't have that many people. So like if you really want to be a part of this, I don't think it's going to be too hard to be. It's just going to be a matter of, as we start to get people in the snowball, making sure that they're able to contribute clearly and without getting in the way of each other. So yeah, I don't know if that's going to be GitHub or some version control, or what, but we are going to have to spin up some collaboration centers for us to talk about. And yeah, that's at least on my list for what needs to be done in January, is making sure that we kind of build the foundation for how we're going to contribute this year.
Yeah, I think the moral of the story is we have the tools, we have the purpose, and now it's just starting to put all the pieces together. We appreciate feedback, so definitely direct any comments our way as well, and we'll continue to iterate as we move forward.
Yeah, willing to open up the call a little bit. Obviously, we do have some time from when we typically end. Happy to give that back to people, but if there are related subjects, unrelated subjects, anything you want to ask or discuss, this is our public recorded version of the call, and it's a great place to do it and get some ideas down and start building off of one another. So if anything hasn't been addressed today that you'd like to see addressed, I'll give you a moment or two to bring it up. All right. Well, all that said, things are obviously kind of in flux in terms of people, in terms of assignments, in terms of work. So feedback is super appreciated, right? A lot of us are doing things we typically don't do. We're trying out new things on the community, and the only way we know if that's working or not is to hear back from you guys. So if you have ideas on how we can make these calls more engaging, or ways to make it easier for someone like you to contribute to Endgame, please do let us know. And if you want to start working on scopes, get in touch with Juan, Retro, Patrick, or myself. We'll facilitate that and yeah, hit the ground running. So I want to give a huge thanks to Hats Protocol, to Retro, and to everyone else who spoke and engaged on this call. It's a real privilege to be able to host these and be a part of this community movement. So you'll see us same time, same place next week. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk soon.